We are back, and you're listening to The Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Garland Nixon. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Thursday said the U.S. will rally the global alliance supporting Ukraine's defensive war against Russia to confront China's global ambitions, calling it a, quote, charged moment for the world. Also, ousted Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan is threatening to destabilize politics in his country if the serving leadership refuses to call for an election, and Pan-Africanists continue to push back against U.S. imperialism. Joining us to discuss these issues, we have Dr. Gerald Horne. He's a professor of history at the University of Houston, Texas. He's an author, historian, researcher. He's got so many books, uncountable number of books out there. You can go to anywhere where they sell books online, any of your major bookstores, and find them. Dr. Horne, welcome back to The Critical Hour.
Thank you for inviting me.
I find it interesting that in what is turning out to be somewhat of a debacle in Ukraine, and with the many problems from the boomerang effect of the Russian sanctions in the so-called global alliance that Secretary of State Antony Blinken talks about, that he would then argue that he can get that same ragtag coalition of the willing and confront China, the big kahuna on the block. Your thoughts on that?
Well, Mr. Blinken's speech yesterday was accidentally revealing. What I mean is that it's apparent that U.S. policy towards China over the past half century has backfired spectacularly. Recall that in 1972, when the overture to China was inaugurated, what was involved was an encircling of the Soviet Union. And then the payoff to China would be these massive direct foreign investments. China, of course, waged war in Vietnam, which is now backfiring because of Vietnam, despite it also being ruled by a communist party, is not necessarily China's closest ally, to put it mildly. But what happened is that what happened 50 years ago with this overdetermination of Moscow is happening again. It's almost as if the imperialists cannot learn lessons. Because recall that Mr. Blinken's speech was preceded by Mr. Biden's trip to Northeast Asia, where he tried to whip up hysteria about both Russia and China. And now we see clearly what some of us have been saying all along, that this war in Central and Eastern Europe is only stage one as far as U.S. imperialism is concerned. And as you put it, stage two involves the big enchilada, the big kahuna, whatever you want to call it, which is China. And so when Mr. Biden was speaking, you had, coincidentally enough, a joint military operation involving Russian and Chinese bombers flying ever so close to Mr. Biden's vicinity in Northeast Asia. Russia and China claimed this was accidental, coincidental. Others are not so sure, because also the news this week brings the tidbit that BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, may be expanding not only to include Argentina, but perhaps even Saudi Arabia, according to news reports, which we had thought was one of Washington's closest allies. Apparently, as one of Saudi's comrades in religious zealotry once said, you look at who's the strong horse and who's the weak horse, and you pick the former. So apparently the Saudis are determining that Russia and China are the strong horse. U.S. imperialism is the weak horse. And then just a few days ago, in news that was underreported on this side of the Atlantic, you had the Collective Security Treaty Organization, titularly led by Moscow, conferring in Moscow with their comrades from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which, as the title suggests, has strong Chinese membership. And so this was the backdrop for Mr. Blinken's speech, where he promised to ratchet up tensions with regard to China, to encircle China, although that's going to be more than a notion if Russia is not on board. And so you see that U.S. imperialism is not only flailing and floundering, but it's taking its European allies down with them. And that is really one of the major head scratchers. which is why do Paris and Berlin and even London allow themselves to be drowned by a flailing and floundering U.S. imperialism? Of course, the short answer is that U.S. imperialism is the guarantor of world imperialism, the guarantor ultimately of French imperialism and German imperialism, etc. And so it seems that all of these North Atlantic powers are destined for doom, which leads to the tantalizing possibility that we may be living through a historic paradigm shift on planet Earth, whereby you begin to see the agonizing retreat of those countries which have dominated planet Earth for the past half millennium, speaking of the North Atlantic powers, and the rise of a new consortium, a multipolar world indeed, that, to the consternation of Mr. Blinken, has the People's Republic of China in the driver's seat. And, of course, U.S. imperialism can thank itself to a degree for that eventuality, insofar as their overdetermination of Moscow led to this massive foreign direct investment in China, which has created this juggernaut, with the latest news being that China's just rolled out an airplane that will challenge Europe's Airbus and Boeing's top-of-the-line jet, which is more bad news for the North Atlantic nations.
You know, speaking of the collection of allies that the U.S. intends to drag along to go after China, confront China, whatever that means, there seems to be some problems amongst that group. Olaf Scholz, he's the Chancellor of Germany. Apparently, he's quoted as saying, "I am not Kaiser Wilhelm." Apparently, he based his course on dealing with the war in Ukraine with a comparison to the First World War. Scholz said at a meeting of the Coalition Committee at the end of April that he would not be the chancellor who accidentally let Germany slip into the war, as Der Spiegel reported on Friday. "I am not Kaiser Wilhelm." What do you make of that, and what does it tell us?
Well, I think that Mr. Schultz, or Sergeant Schultz, as you called him, can read the newspapers. And when he reads the newspapers, he sees that his Social Democrats have been faring poorly in recent elections in key German Länder, or states, including North Rhine-Westphalia, the California of Germany, and Schleswig-Holstein, another prominent state. And he probably noticed the news item about Mario Draghi, the Italian prime minister, calling for amped-up negotiations. If you go back and consult the transcripts of our conversations, you will no doubt find that shortly after February 24th, 2022, I suggested that Italy would be a major sanctions buster. In other words, that they were the most wobbly of the leading EU states, and Mr. Draghi's statement tends to underscore what I've just suggested. And then I assume that Sergeant Schultz has noticed this sort of irredemptive sentiment in neighboring Poland, whereby the Ukrainian regime has basically entered into a de facto alliance with Poland, which then may spread this conflict into Poland and therefore into Germany. Certainly, the news that Finland and Sweden may be joining NATO is not good news, as it has been portrayed in the North Atlantic press, because that would mean, if it happens, and there's some doubt that it will, given Turkish objections, that could drag Germany into another conflict for which it is totally unprepared. And so I understand why Sergeant Schultz is bringing back the long-dead memory of Kaiser Wilhelm, because World War I, 1914 to 1918, was a mortal blow to the pretension of German imperialism, and really only set German imperialism up for the even more staggering blow of its defeat by May 9th, 1945.
Pakistan's ousted Prime Minister Imran Khan has warned the government to call a new election within 6 days, or he will stage a rally and march on the capital, Islamabad, with millions of supporters. He issued the ultimatum on Thursday after he joined the rally of thousands of demonstrators in Islamabad, with plans to overtake part of Islamabad until the government gave in to his demand for new polls. What are your thoughts on Pakistan?
Well, Mr. Imran Khan is in quite a pickle. Recall that he was forced to step down a few weeks ago. He charged that it was because of interference by Yankee imperialism. Recall that just before February 24, 2022, he was in Moscow seeking to make nice to the Russian leadership. That did not go down very well in Washington, because Washington has a problem already. We're trying to turn India, the second largest nation on planet Earth, into an antagonist against China, despite India joining the so-called Quad, Australia, Japan, United States, etc. Prime Minister Modi is not enthusiastic about being used as cannon fodder with regard to confronting China. And in any case, with the Australian elections just a few days ago and the ascension to the prime minister's post of Anthony Party, bringing along with him his dovish foreign minister, Penny Wong, who happens to be of Chinese descent. There is some question about the viability of the so-called Quad, and I'm sure Mr. Khan is paying careful and close attention to that. But things may backfire ultimately for Islamabad. I'm afraid to say that they overplayed their hand when they were all too helpful to the Taliban in coming to power in neighboring Afghanistan. The Taliban, of course, has comrades across the border in Pakistan, the so-called Pakistan religious zealots, who feel that they will have a final vote or determination on the fate and future of Pakistan, irrespective of what Mr. Imran Khan and his party opposition chooses to articulate. So Pakistan, I'm afraid to say, is in for choppy waters, and particularly that applies to Mr. Imran Khan.
Black Agenda Report, Mark Fancher writes, the U.S. gives us hell, but it's a liberated Africa that can douse the flames. He writes, African liberation is the day that African-descended people make progress when joined together in international unity. Internationalism is essential. When U.S. African Command, AFRICOM, was established in 2007, the only thing more offensive than its use of proxy African soldiers to carry out imperialist missions was the appointment of a black man, William Ward, to lead AFRICOM elections. Well, that's happened again, and now they've got Lieutenant General Michael Langley. Your thoughts on this, Dr. Horne?
Well, Langley, coincidentally enough, he carries the surname of the headquarters of the Central Intelligence Agency. Let's hope that that's a coincidence and he did not choose late in life to adopt the surname Langley to get in the good books of U.S. imperialism. Well, his mission as a black American is going to be very problematic. Keep in mind that Mr. Biden just dispatched about 700 U.S. troops to Somalia. That will be a chief priority of Lieutenant General Langley. And this 700-strong force will basically be a Murder Incorporated type force sent to pick off leaders of al-Shabaab, which the United States views not only as, quote, terrorists, unquote, but as, quote, religious zealots, unquote, as well. Recall that recent ventures of U.S. imperialism in Somalia have not gone very well. Reference Black Hawk Down, either the nonfiction story or the hyped-up Hollywood cinema. And you recall how U.S. troops were killed ignominiously some decades ago in the Horn of Africa. But it would not only be Somalia that will be in the spotlight for AFRICOM, because with this attempt to boycott Russia, U.S. imperialism and its North Atlantic allies will have to turn to the natural gas of Algeria. You recall that Sergeant Schultz, Chancellor Schultz of Germany, was just in Senegal this past week talking about Senegal raising its natural gas quotient that it could then send on to Europe. He then flew on to South Africa, where things did not go down very well, insofar as President Ramaphosa told Mr. Schultz that the Germans and the Europeans and the United States should be engaged in a dialogue and negotiations with Russia. They did not expect that sort of response. They expected Mr. Ramaphosa, to bend the knee and sign on to warmongering. And what this suggests is that if we are, in fact, as I suggested a moment or two ago, on the cusp of a paradigmatic shift in international relations, like a seesaw, this may, and underline may, involve the incipient decline of the North Atlantic powers going down on the seesaw and the incipient rise of these African nations going up on the seesaw because they will be able to continue and accelerate relations with the Russia-China condominium, as well as the fact that the North Atlantic countries cannot afford to boycott them. So in some ways, you'll see, I think, that in coming years, both India and Africa will be the joint bells of the ball, being courted by all sides. And I think, and I dare say, that that's good news. And it will also, I'm afraid to say, provide a dilemma for many Black Americans who I don't think have been rather serious with regard to engaging foreign policy. And they will now have to deal with what may wind up to be a conundrum. That is to say, their erstwhile homeland, the United States of America, enduring hyperinflation and a crisis of everyday living as the continent which they have sacralized, speaking of Africa, on the upswing. We'll see if they will view that as good news.
I'm going to throw something at you. I read this in TASS the other day, right? And Nikolai Patrushev, is the secretary of Russia's Security Council, said, the Anglo-Saxon world has for centuries arrogantly ignored the right of third countries to sovereignty for the sake of implementing the idea of the golden billiard. They keep dictating their conditions to the world, arrogantly ignoring the sovereign rights of countries. I kind of feel like Moscow is recognizing that their future lies, I'll just put it like this, with a lot of brown and black countries.
Well, I think you're onto something, because it's apparent that the North Atlantic countries intend to boycott Russia for some time to come. Inevitably, this will cause Russia to seek other partners. And in fact, looking at the Russian economy, I heard an investor from London on RT just today who suggested that the long-term scheme of the North Atlantic countries is rather obvious, which is to basically take over the Russian economy and to disrupt the Russian economy in the short term. In order to foil that scheme, Russia will be looking for other partners. They will find other partners, no doubt, in Africa, but also in the United States' so-called backyard, speaking of Latin America, and reference here the impending debacle that is the Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles, where the United States does not plan to invite Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, which will undoubtedly lead to a weakening of the ambitions of this U.S.-sponsored conference or meeting, which, too, you can see as not necessarily good news for U.S. imperialism.
Thank you very much. We've been talking with Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne is a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas, author of many books. You can find his books wherever books are sold online. He's a historian, researcher, and friend of the show. Dr. Horne, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're listening to The Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik.